The little boy's feet hit the marble floor running. Bare feet, no socks. The wolf pajamas his daddy Julian had picked out, tiny grey wolves printed on soft blue cotton, were twisted sideways like he had dressed himself in the dark or in a hurry, and right now, looking at his face, it was clear it had been a hurry. A terrible, desperate hurry that no 4-year-old should ever know. His name was Remy Zion Raedan, and he was screaming before the elevator doors had fully opened. Not the kind of screaming that comes from a bad dream or a stubbed toe or a cartoon that scared him. This was the kind of screaming that comes from something real, something witnessed, the kind that sits in the throat of a child who has seen what grown people are not supposed to see and whose entire body is trying to carry information too heavy for it. He hit Julian's legs like a freight train. Both arms locked, face pressed in, and then he tilted his head back, chest heaving, tears flying sideways off his cheeks, and he looked up at the 3 biggest, most powerful men in New York City with eyes that held zero doubt. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. They're beating Mom. 4 words. That was all. 4 words and the penthouse, 41 floors above Manhattan, full of expensive things and the particular silence of men who had survived everything, went completely, absolutely still. Dominic Raedan stopped breathing. He was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window, jacket off, glass of cognac in his right hand, and he stopped breathing the way a building stops standing. Not gradually, all at once. The glass didn't fall. His hand didn't shake, but something behind his eyes went dark and then came back as something else entirely. Something colder than anyone in that room had seen before, and these men had seen a great many cold things. Vincent Raedan's fingers froze over the laptop keyboard. He had been mid-sentence on a document no one else in the world was authorized to read, and his fingers simply stopped, suspended above the keys like the rest of the world had been paused by someone with a remote control. His eyes went to Remy's face, stayed there, processed. And in the 3 seconds it took Vincent to process, he had already started running calculations that were going to end very badly for someone. Julian Raedan dropped to his knees. Not slowly, not carefully. He dropped the way people drop when their legs stop working because their heart has taken over, and Julian's heart had always been the loudest thing about him. He caught Remy with both hands, palms on his small shaking shoulders, and looked directly into his son's eyes, and what he saw there confirmed every horrible thing those 4 words had suggested. Remy was not guessing. Remy was not confused. Remy had seen something, processed it with the brutal clarity that small children sometimes have, the clarity that comes before the world teaches them to second-guess themselves, and then he had made a decision. He had not hidden, he had not frozen, he had run full speed toward his father's. Because even at 4 years old, Remy Zion Raedan already understood something most adults never learn. Some problems require the right people. How many? Dominic's voice came from across the room. It was very quiet. That was the thing about Dominic that people always misread. They expected the dangerous version of him to be loud. It was never loud. The louder Dominic got, the safer you were. The quieter he got, the more certain it was that something irreversible was about to happen. Remy held up 3 fingers. The room shifted. Julian's jaw tightened. He pressed one hand to the side of Remy's face, thumb brushing the tears off his cheek, and his voice came out steady and warm even though nothing inside him was steady or warm right now. You did the right thing, you hear me. Coming to us was exactly right. You are the bravest boy I have ever seen. He stood, turned to the man posted at the left of the hallway. Quaim, take him to the safe room, don't leave his side. Quaim Asant, 6'4", built like a defensive end, with a face that had seen 30 years of the world's worst decisions, crossed the room in 3 steps, crouched down to Remy's level, and offered his hand with a gentleness that didn't match the size of him. Remy looked at Julian one more time. Julian nodded once, certain, go. Remy took Quaim's hand. And the 3 Raedan brothers turned toward the elevator with a unity so complete it required no conversation, no signal, no plan spoken aloud. 22 years of building something together, protecting something together, surviving things that should have broken them, and it all compressed into this single hallway moment. 3 men moving as one body toward the worst possible version of a fear they had never let themselves name out loud. Someone had gotten inside. Someone had touched Cassius. The elevator doors closed behind them, and in the reflection of the polished steel, you could see all 3 of their faces, and if you were watching closely, you would notice that not one of them looked afraid. That was the thing that should have scared the people waiting on the residential floor. Fear means you might stop. What was on those 3 faces meant they absolutely would not. The elevator descended. 14 seconds. And what they were about to find on the other side of that door was going to change the architecture of everything, not just their empire, not just their enemies, but the men themselves, in ways that power and money and 20 years of surviving the unsurvivable had never managed to touch. Because Cassius Beaumont had done something to all three of them that no one else had ever done. He had made them need something. And the people on the residential floor had just made the most catastrophic mistake of their lives by touching it. The door to the residential wing was open. That was the first wrong thing, and Dominic clocked it before the elevator had fully stopped. The residential door required a 6-digit code, a keycard registered to 4 people in the entire world, and a fingerprint scan that Vincent had calibrated himself using hardware he'd shipped from a defense contractor in Virginia. 3 layers, 3 separate systems that didn't communicate with each other, because Vincent didn't trust any single system enough to let it talk to another one. That door was standing open like someone had propped it with a shoe. Dominic went through first, shoulder low, body angled, the long muscle memory of a man who had learned very young that doorways are the most dangerous geometry in any room. The hallway beyond was dim, one of the overhead panels was out, which was not an accident, and the air was wrong. There was a smell riding it that Dominic's body recognized before his brain caught up. Copper and sweat and the particular stillness that comes after violence has moved through a space. Vincent pulled up the internal camera feed on his phone as he moved. His eyes flicked between the hallway ahead and the screen in his palm, running both inputs simultaneously, the way his brain had always run things, parallel, layered, nothing wasted. What the camera feed showed made his stomach drop straight through the floor. He grabbed Dominic's arm. 1 second, looked at the screen. Dominic looked. Julian, coming up behind, didn't need to see the screen. He read it on both their faces, and that was enough. Julian started running. The nursery was the 3rd door on the left, and Julian hit it with his shoulder at full speed, and the door gave like it was made of paper, and the scene inside stopped him for exactly 1/2 of 1 second, because the human brain, even a brain trained for crisis, requires a half second to process the thing it most feared finding. Cassius Beaumont was on the floor. He was conscious, barely, eyes open and unfocused, one arm curved over his belly with the instinct of someone who had been protecting something even while being hurt. His face was turned toward the wall. His bottom lip was split. There was bruising already rising along his left cheekbone, dark and spreading, and his right arm was at an angle that made Julian's ribs feel like they were folding inward. 3 men stood in that room. One near the window, one by the door to the adjoining bathroom, one who had been crouching near Cassius and was now straightening up, turning toward the sound of Julian coming through the doorway, reaching toward his left hip where the shape of a holster sat under his jacket. He did not reach it. Dominic came through the doorway behind Julian and crossed the room in 4 steps, and what happened next happened too fast for sequence. Just impact and consequence, the particular efficiency of a man who had spent 2 decades ensuring that the people who threatened his family did not get a second opportunity to do so. Vincent took the man by the window. Julian took the 3rd. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the specific, barely controlled fury of a man who is looking at someone he loves on the floor and is making himself functional when every instinct in him wants to come completely apart. He was not gentle. He had never claimed to be gentle when it counted. He was thorough and he was fast, and when it was over, he was already on his knees beside Cassius before the room had fully settled. Cass, both hands hovering, afraid to touch the wrong place. Cass, look at me. Cassius turned his head. Slow. His eyes found Julian's face and something in them shifted, not relief exactly, but the particular loosening of someone who has been holding themselves together through willpower alone and has just found someone to hand it to. His mouth opened. The first word he said was not help. It was not thank you. It was not even Julian's name. It's Remy. Julian exhaled so hard it was almost a sound. Safe, he's with Quame. He ran straight to us. His voice dropped lower. He was so brave, Cass. You raised him right. Something moved across Cassius's face, then pain and love and exhaustion all arriving at the same moment, and he closed his eyes. Dominic was already on his phone. The family doctor, a woman named Dr. Adrienne Osai, who had been on retainer for 6 years and asked 0 questions, picked up on the second ring. Vincent was crouched over the 3 men on the floor, methodical and cold-eyed, moving through pockets with the focused attention of someone who expected to find exactly what he was looking for. He found it. A phone, active, a signal still running. His eyes went to Dominic. They were live, someone was watching. The room temperature seemed to drop. These 3 men had not been acting alone. They were a feed. A performance for someone sitting somewhere else, watching a screen, receiving confirmation that the message had been delivered. Which meant this wasn't a random attack. This was curated. This was designed. And whoever designed it was still out there, watching, and now they knew the brothers had arrived. Now they knew the response time, the exact number of minutes between the alarm and the retaliation. They had just handed the Raedans' most private metric to an unknown enemy. Vincent pocketed the phone without cutting the signal. Two could play at a live feed. He turned the camera to face the wall and left it running, and his mind was already 3 steps ahead, already building the architecture of what came next, because whoever was on the other end of that signal had just told him something they hadn't meant to. They were watching this family. They had been watching long enough to know exactly when to move, exactly which door to use, exactly how many people to send. That kind of knowledge didn't come from observation. It came from the inside. And Vincent Raedan had just realized, with the cold clarity that made him the most dangerous of the 3 brothers, that the threat was not the 3 men now zip-tied on the nursery floor. The threat was someone in this building. Someone they trusted. Someone who had been trusted long enough to know everything. He looked at Dominic, said nothing, but Dominic read the look the way he had been reading Vincent's silences since they were 9 years old, and his expression did something that it almost never did. It went uncertain. Because if the inside was compromised, then the question wasn't who had gotten in tonight. The question was how long they had already been in. Cassius did not go to the hospital. This was his decision, stated clearly, in a voice that left no room for argument even though it came out rough and low, and cost him something to produce with 2 cracked ribs. He looked at Dr. Adrian Osai from the bed in the main suite, where Julian had carried him, arms under his knees and shoulders like he weighed nothing, though he was 8 months pregnant and weighed considerably more than nothing, and he said, "I need to be where Remy can find me if he wakes up scared." Dr. Osai looked at him, then at Julian, then at the 3 brothers collectively, the way she always looked at them when she needed to communicate something that required all 3 of them to receive it simultaneously. 2 cracked ribs, deep contusion on the left forearm, bruising on the face that's going to look significantly worse before it looks better, and a blood pressure reading that I want to check again in an hour. She paused. The baby's heartbeat is strong. I'm putting that first because I know that's what you want to know first. The breath that left the room in that moment, from all 3 brothers simultaneously, was almost audible. Cassius put his hand flat on his belly, eyes closed, then open again. Good, he said, just that, 1 word, but the weight of it filled the room. Remy was still in the safe room with Quaim. Julian had gone down twice to check, once to find Remy sitting cross-legged on the floor eating crackers with absolute focus, and once to find him asleep against Quaim's arm, 1 fist curled under his chin, looking in sleep exactly like every photograph of Julian at 4 years old. Julian had stood in the doorway of that safe room for 20 seconds doing nothing at all. Just looking, just making sure. Now he was back. All 3 brothers were in the suite, positioned around the room with the unconscious geometry of men who never stopped covering angles even when they were trying to appear relaxed. Dominic at the door, Vincent near the window, Julian in the chair pulled close to the bed, forearms on his knees, close enough that Cassius could reach him if he needed to. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when the loudest question in them is the one no one is ready to ask yet. Cassius asked it first. He always did that, entered the silence before any of them worked up to it. It was one of the things about him that had dismantled all 3 brothers completely, one at a time, over the 8 months he had been part of their world. He didn't wait for permission to say the thing, he just said it. How did they get in? Vincent answered. He always answered the logistical questions because he was the one whose brain catalogued them automatically. Staff access code, we're working on the source. He kept his voice level. The word source sat in the air between them without further explanation, but Cassius was not a man who missed weight in words. His eyes moved to Vincent's face, someone on the inside. Not a question. Vincent met his gaze. Yes. Cassius was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the ceiling, and the movement of his throat told the room exactly what he was working through, not fear exactly. Something older and more practiced than fear. The particular internal recalibration of someone whose history had taught them, repeatedly and without apology, that safety is never the permanent state, that it is always the pause between dangers, that the moment you exhale is almost always the moment something moves. He had been exhaling for 8 months. He had let himself believe, genuinely, carefully, with the tentative hope of someone who had been hurt enough to know what hope costs, that this time was different, that the walls these men had built around him were different, that the name Raedan was a kind of shelter the world would respect. He had almost stopped waiting for the next thing. Almost. They knew I was here, he said to the ceiling. They knew about the baby, they knew which door. He lowered his eyes to the three brothers, moving between their faces. This wasn't random. No, Dominic said, first word he'd said in 20 minutes. It wasn't. Then whoever sent them planned this. His voice was steady. That was the thing about Cassius Beaumont that no one had understood when they first met him. They saw the omega, the soft edges, the vulnerability that he didn't try to hide, and they made an assumption about what lived underneath it. They were wrong every time. Underneath was not weakness. Underneath was a man who had survived things that would have ended most people, and had come out the other side not broken but absolutely clear-eyed. They planned it, and they watched it happen, and they're waiting right now to see what you do next. They're going to find out, Julian said quietly. Cassius looked at him. I know. He reached out and put his hand over Julian's. That's not what I'm worried about. Julian turned his palm up, held on. Then what? Julian asked. Cassius looked at all three of them. Took a breath that visibly cost him. Ribs, the reminder of what had happened in this building tonight, in a room where silver stars turned on a mobile, and the walls were painted a soft sage green, and everything had been chosen to be safe. I'm worried about who they're going to send next, he said, because that wasn't their best. Those three men tonight, they were a message, not a solution. His eyes went to Vincent. Whoever is behind this sent 3 people to beat a pregnant omega in a nursery. They wanted you to see that. They wanted you to react. He paused. So the question isn't what you do to those 3 men. The question is what you do about the person who sent them, because that person is still out there, and they already know exactly how fast you came running. The silence that followed was the longest one of the night. Because he was right. And all 3 brothers knew it. And knowing it meant that the chain of events that started the moment Remy's bare feet hit the marble upstairs was nowhere near its end. They had handled tonight. They had found Cassius, secured Remy, contained the 3 men who had entered this building. But somewhere in this city, maybe watching a screen, maybe already moving to the next phase, someone was evaluating their response. Someone patient enough to get inside before they struck. Someone who understood that the most effective way to break a powerful man is not to attack the thing he has built. It is to attack the thing he loves. And this family had just confirmed, in the most visible way possible, exactly what that was. Vincent found the first crack at 2:14 in the morning. He was alone in the surveillance room on the 14th floor, a room that existed on no official building schematic, accessed through a panel in the maintenance corridor that looked like a wall to everyone who didn't know what they were looking at. He had been in this room for 4 hours. The surface of the desk was covered in open windows, live feeds, financial records, personnel files, and the quiet, humming architecture of a man who was taking apart his own system piece by piece, looking for the place it had failed. He found it in a man named Darnell Webb. Darnell had been the night doorman for this building for 7 years. Quiet man, reliable, showed up early, left on time, knew every resident by name and never discussed them. Vincent had personally approved his hire, had run background on him twice, once at the initial hire, once 18 months ago during a routine security update, and found nothing. Clean record, no known associations. A daughter in middle school in Queens, and a mother in a care facility in the Bronx that cost $1,100 a month, which was not outside the range of what Vincent paid his staff. The second look told a different story. The care facility cost had gone up, significantly. 6 months ago, it had jumped from $1,100 to $3,000 a month because of a specialized memory care unit that Darnell's mother needed, and that insurance covered only partially. $3,000 a month on a doorman's salary. Darnell had not asked for a raise. Darnell had not taken a second job, as far as any official record showed. Darnell had simply continued showing up, early, reliable, knowing every resident by name and never discussing them. Vincent pulled the door access logs for the past 90 days. He found 7 entries. 7 times, the residential wing door had been accessed using Darnell's credentials during hours when Darnell was logged as on shift in the lobby. Lobby feed confirmed it each time. Darnell, downstairs at his post, visible on camera. Someone had his code. Someone had cloned his credentials without his knowledge, or Darnell had sold them without understanding what they were really being used for. Vincent leaned toward the first, not because he couldn't believe Darnell capable of it. Anyone was capable of anything when the pressure was specific enough, and the need was real enough. He leaned toward the first because of the timestamps. The 7 entries were spaced too carefully. Too strategically distributed across different shifts, different days, chosen specifically to avoid pattern recognition in a standard automated audit. The person using those credentials knew how the system was reviewed. That meant they had reviewed it themselves. Vincent sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and allowed himself exactly 45 seconds to feel the full weight of what he was looking at. 45 seconds to sit with the fact that his system, the system he had built and tested and trusted and staked his family's safety on, had been studied as carefully as he had studied everything else. Someone had done to him exactly what he did to his enemies. They had mapped him. He gave himself the 45 seconds. Then he closed that feeling down, filed it, and got back to work. Because the breach was real and the source was identifiable, and the path from the source led somewhere, and Vincent Raedan was very, very good at following paths. The shell company appeared at 3:07 a.m. It was registered in Delaware, which was where shell companies went when they wanted to be boring. Delaware incorporations were so common that even sophisticated financial surveillance tools underweighted them. The company was called Meridian Facilities Group, which sounded exactly like the kind of name that processed medical billing or managed corporate janitorial contracts, the kind of name that made the human eye slide right past it without stopping. It had filed a standard operating report 18 months ago and had not filed anything since, which was legal in Delaware for the first 2 years and therefore invisible to any standard review. It had made 3 payments to 3 different people. All 3 people worked in this building. Vincent did not move for a long time. 3 payments, 3 people, and the payment amounts were not dramatic, they were calibrated, specific to each person's most pressing financial need, not enough to make someone wealthy, just enough to solve the exact problem that was keeping them up at night, the kind of money that doesn't feel like a bribe, it feels like a lifeline. Darnell's mother's care, an amount that covered 6 months of the difference. The second payment went to a woman named Irene Caldwell, the housekeeper who had been with the building for 4 years. Irene had a daughter who needed a surgery, a real surgery, documented, the kind of surgery that costs $40,000 and that insurance denied twice and that had been sitting in appeals for 14 months. The payment to Irene was $42,000, processed through a medical billing intermediary that made it look like an insurance settlement. The third payment. Vincent looked at the third name for a long time. It was a man named Saul Merritt, listed in their own staff roles as kitchen assistant, references verified, hired 8 months ago, 3 weeks after Cassius had told the brothers about the pregnancy. 8 months ago. Vincent picked up his phone and called Dominic, 2 rings. "I have 3 names," he said, "and a company, and whoever is behind the company has been in this building for 8 months. He paused. "They went in the day after Cassius told us about the baby." The silence on Dominic's end lasted 4 seconds. That was a long silence for Dominic. "They knew about the pregnancy," Dominic said. "Yes. That fast. That fast." Another silence. "Which means," Dominic started. "Which means we have a 4th leak," Vincent said. "Somewhere closer in than any of those 3 names. Someone who heard about the pregnancy early enough to mobilize a cover identity and get a plant inside our kitchen within 3 weeks. He let that land. "Dominic, this has been running longer than 8 months. Those 3 on the floor tonight were the visible part. The rest of it is underneath, deep underneath." There was a pause. When Dominic spoke again, his voice was the quietest Vincent had ever heard it. "Find the source, all the way back. I don't care how long it takes or what it costs." "Already working," Vincent said. He hung up and turned back to the screens. And on one of the monitors in the bottom left corner, a feed from the camera he had repositioned in the nursery, the one that had been live when they arrived, there was a detail he had noticed earlier and not yet fully processed. The angle of the camera. Someone had adjusted it before tonight, subtly, by less than 3 degrees, an adjustment so small that no automated calibration check would flag it, but 3 degrees was enough to eliminate the left corner of the room from the frame. The left corner, where the panic button was sewn into the lining of Cassius's jacket. Vincent stared at the screen. Whoever had adjusted that camera knew about the panic button, knew its location in the room, knew that eliminating it from the camera's view would also create a 3-second blind spot during any emergency response, 3 seconds where the camera appeared to cover the room but actually didn't. 3 seconds wasn't much. 3 seconds was everything. He pulled the camera calibration logs going back 6 months. The adjustment had been made 11 weeks ago. On a Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m. by someone whose access credentials matched a name that made Vincent go completely still in his chair. Because the name was not Darnell or Irene or Saul. The name was someone who had been in this building every single day for 2 years. Someone who had access to every room. Someone who had been present the morning after Cassius told the brothers about the pregnancy, because that person was always present, always nearby, always trusted. Vincent closed his eyes. Opened them. Picked up the phone. This call was not to Dominic. The sun came up over Manhattan, and the Raedan brothers did not sleep. Cassius slept finally, deeply, ribs taped and body exhausted, and the baby's heartbeat confirmed steady. He had dropped into sleep the way people drop into it when they have been running on adrenaline for hours, and the body simply stops negotiating. Julian sat in the chair beside him and did not move. He watched Cassius breathe. Counted the breaths without meaning to, the way parents count things, not from anxiety, but from the specific tenderness of needing to confirm, over and over, that something precious is still here. Dominic stood in the main hallway outside the suite door, phone in hand, making calls in a voice so quiet the words were nearly shapes rather than sounds. Vincent had not left the surveillance room. By 6 a.m., he had built a complete picture of the breach, not a theory, a documented, time-stamped, financially traced picture of exactly how the Raedan family's most guarded location had been systematically opened from the inside over the course of 8 months. He had the shell company's paper trail going back further than Delaware, routed through an account in the Cayman Islands tied to a holding entity in Luxembourg, the kind of financial architecture that was specifically designed to end at a wall. He ended at the wall. And then he went around it, because Vincent Raedan had learned 15 years ago that every financial wall has a maintenance door, and maintenance doors open if you know who built them. The holding entity in Luxembourg had one registered director. The director's name was a woman named Celeste Fontaine, which was almost certainly not her real name, but the photograph attached to the registration was real. Financial registrations required biometric verification at that level, and biometrics couldn't be faked the same way names could. Vincent ran the photograph through 3 separate facial recognition systems, 2 of which he was not legally supposed to have access to. The third one returned a match. And the match was a name he recognized. Not personally, but professionally. The way you recognize a name that has existed in your peripheral vision for years, mentioned in certain conversations, attached to certain events, always at a distance that made it feel like a historical reference rather than an active threat. The name belonged to a man. A man who had been declared dead 4 years ago. A man named Armand Voss. Vincent stared at the photograph and the name and the weight of what they meant together, and for the first time in 4 hours of relentless methodical work, he stopped moving, stopped typing, just sat with it. Because if Voss was alive, then everything they thought they had resolved 4 years ago was not resolved. It was deferred. Every decision they had made in the belief that Voss was no longer a variable, every alliance they had built, every vulnerability they had left unaddressed because they thought a specific threat had been eliminated, all of it had been made on a false foundation. And Voss had known that. Had let them build on it. Had watched them build a family on it. The nursery, the mobile with the silver stars, the panic button sewn into the jacket lining that he had somehow known about. 8 months of patience, of placement, of methodical inside work, not because he wanted to destroy the Raedan Empire. He could have done that at any number of points over 4 years if destruction was the goal. He wanted something specific. He wanted them to know he could reach inside. He wanted them to feel it. Vincent picked up the phone to call Dominic and then he put it down, stood up, walked upstairs himself. This was not a phone call. He found Dominic in the hallway outside the suite, and Julian must have heard him coming because the suite door opened and Julian stepped out, pulling it quiet behind him so Cassius could keep sleeping. All 3 of them in the hallway. The light coming through the far window was early morning grey, the city below just beginning to fill with sound. Vincent said the name. The hallway did something unusual after that. It became the kind of quiet that isn't about absence of sound, but about the specific weight of 3 men processing something simultaneously. Dominic's expression moved through several things in the space of 2 seconds: recognition, calculation, the cold arrival of understanding, and then settled into the kind of stillness that preceded his most consequential decisions. Julian said nothing for a long moment. Then, he's been watching us build this family. Yes, Vincent said. He saw Cassius. Saw the pregnancy, positioned someone inside within 3 weeks of us knowing about it. Julian's jaw shifted. He used the baby as a clock, waited until Cassius couldn't move fast, couldn't run. Yes. Julian looked at the suite door. At the closed door behind which Cassius was sleeping with 2 cracked ribs and a baby 8 months along, and a bruise rising on his face that had been put there deliberately, specifically, as a piece of theatre in someone else's long game. When Julian turned back to his brothers, the warmth that people loved him for, the ease, the charm, the way he made every room feel safer, was not there. What was there was something that had always lived underneath it, something his brothers knew and the rest of the world only ever glimpsed in the moments when it became unavoidable. Find him, Julian said, not his people, him. We don't have the location yet, Vincent said. Then we get it, Julian looked at Dominic, whatever it takes, however long. Dominic nodded once. But Vincent was already thinking past the agreement, because Vincent always thought past the agreement to the thing the agreement didn't account for. And what he was thinking was this: Voss was not hiding. A man who orchestrated an 8-month inside operation and then had it executed on a specific night was not hiding. He was positioned, he was waiting. Which meant moving directly at him was exactly what he expected. Which meant that if they moved directly, and they had to, Julian was already looking at the door and Dominic was already making the face he made before he dismantled things. Voss would be ready. They were going to walk into whatever he had prepared. And Vincent needed to solve that before they took a single step. Give me 48 hours, he said. Julian looked at him. I'm not saying wait, Vincent said. I'm saying let me build the approach. Because if we go at him the way he expects us to go at him, we're giving him exactly the move he's already planned for. He paused. He studied us for 4 years. He knows how we respond to threats against this family. He watched tonight specifically to measure it. The response time, the order of priority. Who went to Remy first, who went to Cassius, who went for the tactical data. Vincent looked at both of them. He already knows what we're going to do, so we can't do what we're going to do. The hallway was quiet. Dominic was looking at him with the expression he wore when he hated something and knew it was right. 48 hours, Dominic said finally. Julian turned back toward the suite door. I'll be with Cassius, he said. No argument, but his voice had the quality of a timer, the kind that runs clean and exact and does not pause. He went back inside. Dominic looked at Vincent. He won't wait longer than that. He won't need to, Vincent said. He turned back toward the surveillance room. Because somewhere in the architecture of what he already knew, the shell company, the credentials, the camera adjustment, the photograph and the name, there was a thread he hadn't pulled yet. A thread that Voss had left, perhaps intentionally, perhaps as a test, perhaps as the arrogance of a man who had been invisible so long he believed he was permanently invisible. And Vincent Raedan had never in his life left a thread unpulled. The question that was going to keep every single viewer awake tonight was not whether the brothers would find Voss. The question was what Voss was doing right now, in whatever room he was sitting in, watching whatever feed he had managed to maintain access to, and whether the thing he was watching was going to show him exactly what he wanted to see. Or whether Vincent had already started making sure it showed him something else entirely. The rumor moved through the underworld the way rumors always moved, fast, quiet, and smelling like truth. By Tuesday morning, 3 separate sources had reported the same thing to 3 separate people who had no connection to each other. The story was consistent in every detail, which was exactly how Vincent had designed it. Consistency was the thing that made a lie feel like a fact. Anyone could plant a rumor. Only someone who understood how information traveled could plant one that arrived at its destination, still intact. The story was this: the Raedan brothers were fracturing. The attack on Cassius had done what no enemy had managed to do in 22 years of building. It had cracked them from the inside. Julian had not spoken to Dominic in 36 hours. Vincent had locked himself in the surveillance room and was not responding to anyone. And Cassius, traumatized, 2 cracked ribs, 8 months pregnant and reportedly furious, had told Julian that he wanted to leave the building, that he did not feel safe. That safe was the one thing the Raedan name had promised him, and the one thing it had failed to deliver. The rumor said Julian agreed with him. The rumor said Julian was already making arrangements. The rumor was entirely constructed, every word of it. Julian had not said anything of the sort. Cassius had not asked to leave. Vincent had not locked himself away in silence. He had locked himself away in the most productive 48 hours of surveillance work in the family's history. And Dominic had not stopped speaking to anyone. He had, in fact, been on the phone almost continuously, building the second and third layers of the operation that the rumor was designed to enable. But Armand Voss did not know that. And Armand Voss, it turned out, was not as patient as he believed himself to be. That was the thread Vincent had found, not in a financial record or a camera log or a personnel file. He found it in the behavioral data, 12 years of documented decisions, operations, and responses from a man who had spent so long being invisible that he had developed one very specific blind spot. He could not resist confirming his own work. Every major operation Voss had run in his career, Vincent had traced 6 of them, going back to before the Raedan brothers had even taken over from their father, ended the same way. The operation would land, the target would be destabilized, and then within 72 hours Voss would move, not to attack, to observe. He needed to see the result up close, needed to verify with his own infrastructure that the damage was real and the collapse was progressing. It was the one place his discipline failed. He had waited 4 years to move on the Raedans. He would not wait 72 hours to confirm it was working. The rumor was bait. The fracture was a stage. And Vincent had spent 48 hours building the set. The financial records were the most intricate part. Real transactions, routed through real accounts that told a story of emergency asset movement, the kind of movement that happened when a family was preparing for internal division. Julian's portion of 3 shared holdings being quietly separated, not liquidated, separated. The detail that made it convincing was that detail. Liquidation would look like panic. Separation looked like a man making careful, private decisions that he had not yet told his brothers about. Voss's financial surveillance, and he had financial surveillance. Vincent had confirmed this by leaving a specific, traceable data point inside one of the Raedan accounts, and then watching where it appeared 22 hours later, would pick up the asset separation within a day. It picked it up in 18 hours. Which told Vincent 2 things. Voss was watching constantly. And he was close. Not close in the sense of nearby, necessarily, close in the sense of active, engaged. His infrastructure was running in real time, which meant he had people dedicated specifically to monitoring the Raedans and reporting back on a live basis. That level of resource commitment meant Voss had not set this operation up as a long-distance strike. He was personally invested in the outcome. He was going to want to see it himself. Vincent brought Dominic and Julian into the surveillance room at 9 p.m. on Tuesday. He laid out the full map, the bait, the stage, the behavioral pattern, the financial trace, the projected window. He spoke for 11 minutes without stopping, the way he always briefed when the situation was complex and the margin for misunderstanding was 0. When he finished, Julian looked at the map on the screen for a long moment. "He's going to send someone to confirm the fracture is real," Julian said. "Yes. And when they confirm it, he moves." Within 24 hours of confirmation, based on the pattern, yes. Then the confirmation has to be convincing. Julian turned to look at Vincent directly, which means the performance has to be real enough that whoever Voss sends to verify it believes it. "Yes," Vincent said, "and the person he sends is going to be someone with enough context to evaluate what they're seeing, not a foot soldier, someone who knows us." The room went quiet. Because that sentence had a specific implication, and all 3 brothers understood it simultaneously. For Voss to send someone who knew the Raedan family well enough to verify an internal fracture, that person had to have real access, real proximity, real history with them. The 4th lake. The one whose credentials had adjusted the nursery camera 11 weeks ago. That person wasn't gone. Vincent had identified them but had not moved on them, deliberately, surgically, because a sealed leak was a dead resource, an open leak was a door. And the door was about to be used. Dominic looked at the screen. At the name Vincent had found 11 weeks ago in the camera calibration logs, the name that had made all 3 of them go quiet in that upstairs hallway. "We let them come," Dominic said. "We welcome them," Vincent said. Julian said nothing for a moment. Then he stood up and straightened his jacket, and the warmth came back into his face, the way a light comes back on, deliberate, controlled, completely convincing. "Then I have a performance to prepare," he said. He walked out of the surveillance room. And behind him, on one of Vincent's monitors, a small green indicator light blinked twice. Voss's financial surveillance had just pinged the asset separation data. The clock had started. The man who came to verify the fracture was named Terence Okafor. He had worked for the Raedan family for 3 years as a logistics coordinator, a position that gave him access to scheduling, movement patterns, meeting locations, and the particular rhythm of how the three brothers operated on a daily basis. He was 38 years old, quiet, meticulous, and had always been, in everyone's assessment, completely trustworthy. He knocked on the door of Julian's private study at 10:14 a.m. on Wednesday morning. Julian answered it himself. He looked, and this was the performance. This was what 6 hours of deliberate, careful construction had produced, like a man at the end of something. Not broken. Julian Raedan did not break visibly, but there was a looseness to him that wasn't natural, a distraction in his eyes, a tiredness that sat too high up in his face to be about sleep. He was in a white shirt with the cuffs rolled up, and his hair was not quite right, and the room behind him, visible over his shoulder, showed 2 packed bags near the far wall. The bags were real. The clothes in them were real. They had been packed by Julian himself at 4 a.m., because if you were going to perform a detail, you performed every layer of it. Terence looked at the bags. Julian let him look. "I only have a few minutes," Julian said, not cold, tired. The difference mattered. Cold would have suggested an argument, an active rupture. Tired suggested something further along, a decision already made and now simply being lived with. "Of course," Terence said. He had a folder in his hand. Logistics review, he told Quame at the front desk. A standard check-in on supply routes for the month. Routine. Nothing about Terence was routine today. Julian let him in, offered nothing, did not sit, stood near the window with his arms crossed at the waist, not defensive, just holding himself, and looked at the Manhattan skyline while Terence went through the motions of the logistics review. Page 1, page 2. The questions were real questions with real answers, and Julian gave real answers, and the whole performance of the meeting was so convincingly ordinary that the extraordinary information it was designed to collect almost seemed incidental. Almost. Terence asked about the schedule for the following week. Julian said he wouldn't be here for it. A pause, precisely calibrated, just long enough to feel unscripted. "Cass and I are," Julian stopped, exhaled through his nose, started again with the particular effort of someone editing themselves in real time, choosing what to share and what to keep. "We need some space from the building, after what happened." "Of course," Terence said. His voice was appropriately sympathetic. His hands, Julian noted without looking directly at them, had gone very still. "Dominic doesn't agree with the decision," Julian said, simply, like he was offering a fact rather than driving a wedge, "but it's not his choice." The room held that for a moment. Terence finished the logistics review 4 minutes later, thanked Julian, left. Julian stood at the window and watched the skyline and did not move until his earpiece, hidden below his right ear, clicked once. Vincent's voice, quiet and without inflection. "He's on the phone, encrypted line, routing to a relay in Brussels." Brussels. Vincent had narrowed Voss's location to 3 European cities. Brussels had just become the lead. Julian uncrossed his arms, rolled his cuffs back down, buttoned them with the particular care of a man whose hands needed something deliberate to do while his mind did something else entirely. "How long?" he said quietly. "Until Voss moves, 12 hours, maybe less." Vincent paused. The performance was clean, by the way. "I know," Julian said. He looked at the 2 packed bags near the wall. For one unguarded second, something real crossed his face. Not about the operation, not about Voss, about the bags, about the fact that they contained clothes he had actually chosen, about the fact that the reason he had been able to perform a man preparing to leave was because the fear that he might someday have to had always been real. He loved Cassius in a way that was inconvenient and total, and completely outside the vocabulary of the life he had been raised inside. He loved Remy with the specific ferocity of a man who became a father without planning to, and discovered that fatherhood was the most clarifying thing that had ever happened to him. And 3 days ago, someone had put their hands on both of them. Inside the house he had helped build. The bags weren't just a performance. They were a reminder of what was at stake. He picked up his phone. Called Dominic. "It worked," he said. Dominic's response was one word: efficient, final. "Good." And then the part Julian had not told Dominic yet. The the part he had been sitting with since the meeting ended, and the door had closed behind Terence Okafor, and Julian had turned back to the window and thought about what he had seen in that room. Dominic, he said, Terence wasn't just verifying for Voss. A pause. He was memorizing the layout, Julian said, where the bags were, which window, the position of the furniture. He was building a map. The silence on the line told him Dominic understood exactly what that meant. Voss wasn't coming to observe from a distance. He was coming in. And he was sending Terence's information ahead of him to prepare the entry. The stage Julian had built to lure Voss into view had just told them something the performance was never designed to reveal. Voss had never intended to stay hidden. This had always been his plan. Not destruction of the empire. Not financial ruin. He wanted the brothers at their most divided, their most exposed, their most human. And then he wanted to walk through the front door and take what he came for. The only question, the one that punched through every carefully constructed layer of Vincent's plan and left a clean, cold hole in the center of it, was what, exactly, Armand Voss had come to take. Voss moved at 3 a.m. on Thursday. Not in the way they expected. That was the first adjustment, and it hit Vincent like ice water because he had accounted for 11 entry scenarios, and this was not any of them. He had expected Voss to come through the building, through Terence's mapped layout, through whatever access point the logistics man had identified and communicated. He had the lobby covered, the maintenance corridor, the parking structure, the rooftop access. Every door, every panel, every credentialed entry point in the building had eyes on it by midnight. Voss did not go through the building. He went through the city. Specifically, he went through the financial infrastructure of 4 different Raedan holdings simultaneously, a coordinated digital strike that launched at 3:04 a.m. and was designed to do one thing: pull Vincent off the surveillance systems and onto the financial defense. Because any organization's crisis response had a capacity limit, and Voss had mapped the Raedan capacity the same way he had mapped everything else. 2 major threat streams at once, and one of the brothers would have to split focus. It was the correct play. It was also anticipated. Vincent had built a secondary system specifically for this scenario, a financial firewall managed by an outside team in a secure location that would engage automatically without requiring his direct input. And when the strike launched, he watched it trigger the firewall and watched the firewall hold, and he felt something very close to satisfaction move through him for exactly 3 seconds before the second adjustment arrived. Terence Okafor was not in his apartment. The tale Vincent had placed on Terence, a woman named Solange Thibodeau, who worked 3 blocks from Terence's building and had been watching his movements for 48 hours, reported at 3:11 a.m. that Terence had left through a back exit at 2:47 a.m., before the financial strike launched, before any alarm had sounded. He had left before the operation started. Which meant Terence was not a messenger. He was a component. He was already moving toward his position before the first shot was fired, because he had known the timetable. He had been given it. And the position he was moving toward was not the lobby, or the maintenance corridor, or any of the entry points Vincent had covered. Vincent pulled the building schematics one more time and looked at what he had not covered. It was almost insultingly simple. The residential wing had a window on the northeast corner, 3rd floor, exterior, a window that had been painted shut 14 months ago during a renovation and had therefore been removed from the active security grid, because painted shut windows were not considered entry vulnerabilities. They were not entry vulnerabilities for ordinary people. For someone carrying the right equipment, a painted shut window on the 3rd floor of a Manhattan building was a 40-second problem. Vincent was already running before he had finished the thought. He hit his earpiece. Dominic, northeast corner residential, 3rd floor, right now. Dominic was in the hallway outside Cassius's suite. He heard Vincent's voice and moved immediately, no questions, the way they had always operated when Vincent used that specific register, the one that was not urgent, not panicked, because Vincent was never panicked, but that carried a frequency of absolute certainty that something was happening and happening now. Julian was asleep in the chair beside Cassius's bed. He wasn't asleep anymore. The sound that woke him was not loud. It was the particular sound of a window giving the soft crack of painted seal breaking, followed by a silence that was immediately wrong in the way that silences are wrong when something has just changed the air pressure of a room. He was on his feet before he had consciously decided to stand. Cassius's eyes opened. He and Julian looked at each other across the dim room, and no words passed between them because none were needed. Cassius had lived enough dangerous days to know that sound. Julian had spent 20 years learning to respond to it. "Bathroom," Julian said, quietly, completely calm. "Lock the door. Do not open it until you hear my voice and Dominic's voice together. Both of us." Cassius was already moving. Slow, ribs, pregnancy, the physics of an 8-month belly, but moving with the focused determination of a man who had learned in the hardest possible way that the difference between a bad outcome and a catastrophic one was the 5 seconds where you chose to act instead of freeze. He made it to the bathroom. The lock clicked. Julian turned toward the suite door. In the hallway, he found Dominic already positioned, back to the wall, facing the northeast corridor, absolutely still in the particular way of a man who has done this enough times to know that stillness is its own kind of weapon. Between them and the northeast corner, 30 feet of carpeted hallway, 2 closed doors, and the sound of careful, deliberate footsteps. More than one person. Julian held up 2 fingers to Dominic, a question. Dominic held up 3. 3. Not Terence alone. Vincent came up the stairwell behind them. He had taken the stairs deliberately, avoiding the elevator's sound, and the 3 brothers formed the same configuration they had formed 3 nights ago. Dominic forward, Vincent right, Julian left. But this time there was no door to breach. This time they were the ones already inside. And the 3 men moving down that hallway were about to discover the same catastrophic truth that the first 3 had discovered in the nursery. The Raedans had responded, the Raedans had adapted, and the Raedans were already exactly where they needed to be. The first man came around the corner. What followed was not elegant. It was thorough. 22 seconds, 3 men efficiently managed in a residential hallway at 3 a.m., with the city humming 40 floors below and the baby 8 days from birth sleeping peacefully through the entire thing, because the bathroom door was solid, and the lock was good, and Cassius had his hand pressed flat against it from the inside, counting the seconds until he heard what Julian had told him to wait for. Julian's voice, then Dominic's, both of them. 2 minutes and 14 seconds after Julian had told him to lock the door, he heard them. Cassius, Julian close, right outside. "It's done," Dominic, also close. He opened the door. Julian was right there, like he had been standing with his hand on the other side of it the entire time. He looked, there was no word for what Julian looked like in that moment except present, more present than any person Cassius had ever seen, like he had poured every single part of himself into the act of being in this exact doorway. Cassius leaned his forehead against Julian's chest. Julian put both arms around him, careful of the ribs, careful of everything. Behind them, down the hallway, Vincent was already on his phone, and the thing he was saying, quietly, precisely, in the tone that meant a series of irreversible things was now being set in motion, was the word that had started everything. A name. Voss. Because the 3rd man they had taken down in that hallway, the one who had come around the corner last, the one who had hung back in the particular way of someone directing rather than executing, was not anonymous muscle. He was carrying identification that was false in every detail. But his face was real. And his face matched the photograph from the Luxembourg financial registration that Vincent had been carrying in his memory for 3 days like a stone in his shoe. Armand Voss had not watched from a distance. He had come himself. And now he was zip-tied on the hallway floor of the home he had spent 4 years trying to destroy, looking up at 3 men who had just removed the last option he had. He didn't look broken. That was the thing that would stay with all 3 brothers afterward. He looked, if anything, like a man who had expected to lose and had come anyway. That meant something. And Vincent needed to know what. Armand Voss spoke for 41 minutes. He did not require persuasion. That was unexpected. He sat in the chair they put him in, bound, composed, the particular stillness of a man who has decided that the scene playing out is not a defeat but a conclusion, and he talked with the calm of someone who had been waiting a long time to say certain things out loud. He talked about the Raedan brothers' father. He talked about a specific night, 26 years ago, when a younger version of Eldridge Raedan had made a decision that cost Voss everything he had built up to that point. Not through violence, through testimony. Eldridge had spoken to federal investigators, not about his own operation, which he had successfully obscured, but about Voss's. Specific details, specific dates, specific locations that only someone with real proximity could have known. Eldridge had burned Voss's operation and walked away clean. And then he had died 4 years later, before Voss could respond. So Voss had done the next most logical thing. He had waited. He had watched the sons build what the father started, had documented their lives with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to put his focus and unlimited time to give it. He had watched them become powerful and then more powerful, and at some point the mission had shifted, not revenge exactly, not anymore, something more like proof. He needed to demonstrate to himself as much as anyone that the Raedan name could be reached, that power built on a foundation of betrayal could be dismantled. That what Eldridge had taken from him could be taken back in kind, from the next generation. He had targeted Cassius specifically because Cassius was the proof. Not a weapon, proof, evidence that the brothers could be broken the same way most men were broken, not by attacking what they had built, but by threatening what they loved. Vincent listened to all of it without speaking. Dominic stood at the far end of the room with his arms folded, and the expression he wore when he was filing everything, every word, every detail, every implication. Julian sat in the corner. And what happened to Julian's face over the course of those 41 minutes was quiet and private and significant. He had come in with the controlled anger of a man who had been maintaining a performance for 72 hours. He left with something different, not softer, exactly, clearer, like something had shifted in the arrangement of things, and the shift was uncomfortable and necessary at the same time. Because here was what Voss's 41 minutes had actually delivered, underneath all the history and the strategy and the proof of how thoroughly he had studied them. He had shown the brothers the exact map of their vulnerabilities. Not to taunt them. Because he was done. Whatever he had come to do, confirm, witness, complete, he had done it. He had walked into the building himself. He had looked the three brothers in the face. He had seen Remy's photograph on the wall of the hallway and had looked at it for 3 full seconds before looking away. And then he had sat down and talked for 41 minutes with the completeness of a man closing a chapter. He was not escaping, he was not negotiating, he was not asking for anything. He was finishing. When he stopped talking, the room was quiet for a while. Then Dominic said, "You came here to be caught." Voss looked at him, the look confirmed it without a word. "Why?" Dominic said. A pause, long enough to be considered. "Because I needed to see," Voss said finally, "whether the sons were the same as the father." The room sat with that. Dominic's jaw shifted, and Voss looked at the three of them, one at a time, then at the photograph of Remy still visible through the open doorway at the end of the hall. Quaim had put it there, framed, because Remy had drawn it himself and insisted on its placement with the authority of a 4-year-old who had very clear ideas about interior decoration. "No," Voss said, "you're not." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Vincent made the calls that needed to be made. Voss was removed from the building by people whose job it was to remove things without leaving marks on the record, and what happened to Armand Voss after that point was a legal and financial matter handled by the kind of lawyers whose work was never discussed in public. The result was complete, permanent, the kind of ending that came with no headline and no appeal. It was done. But the room where Voss had sat and talked for 41 minutes held something that didn't leave with him. Julian was the one who named it. He had been quiet for most of the conversation, sitting in the corner, listening, and now he stood in the emptied room and looked at his brothers and said, "We built walls around Cassius, and we never asked him which ones felt like protection and which ones felt like a cage." Dominic looked at him. "We made him safe by our definition," Julian said, "not his." Vincent looked at the floor, then up. The panic button was sewn into his jacket because it was the most secure location. He never knew it was there. The sentence sat like a stone dropped in still water. Cassius had been in this building for 8 months with a panic button he didn't know existed, in a home designed to the exact specifications of 3 men who loved him, and had not once, sat down and asked him what safety felt like from the inside. They had protected him the way they protected everything else. Like a territory. Not like a person. The realization moved through all 3 brothers differently. Dominic went very still. Vincent recalculated with the look of a man who has found an error in a system he was certain was airtight. Julian felt it the way Julian felt most things, fully, immediately in his chest and his throat and the backs of his hands. Upstairs, Cassius was awake. And for the first time since the night it happened, Julian walked upstairs without a plan, without an update to deliver or a security development to report or a reassurance to offer. He walked upstairs just to sit with him. And when he got to the door of the suite and opened it, Cassius looked up from the bed and said, before Julian could speak, "I heard him through the floor, he meant Voss, is it over?" "Yes," Julian said. Cassius nodded, a long nod that travelled from his chin all the way to something deep behind his eyes. Then he said the thing Julian had not been prepared for. "I need to tell you something," Cassius said, "about the night it happened, about before they came in." He looked at Julian steadily. "I knew something was wrong 2 hours before, I felt it, and I didn't say anything because I didn't want to." He started again. "I didn't want to use up your attention. I thought I was being dramatic. I told myself I was fine." Julian sat on the edge of the bed. He did not speak for a moment. "You've been doing that," he said finally, "since you got here, telling yourself you're fine so you don't cost us anything." Cassius looked at the window, at the city outside, at everything except the truth of what Julian had just said. "Then, yes." Julian reached over and took his hand. "That ends now," he said, not as a command, as a commitment. Cassius looked back at him. And the thing that moved across his face in that moment, complex and relieved and slightly terrified, because hope always carried terror inside it for people who had been burned by it, was more honest than anything the walls of that building had ever contained. Outside the room, in the hallway, Dominic stood with his back against the wall and his arms folded and said nothing. But when Vincent came up beside him, and they both stood there listening to the quiet of the suite beyond the door, Dominic said quietly, to no one in particular, "We got it wrong." "Yes," Vincent said. "We fix it." "Yes." There was a pause. Starting with asking, Dominic said. And for a man who had built his entire life on having the answers before the questions arrived, that sentence cost him something real. The baby came 8 days later at 4:47 in the morning. Not in a hospital. In the suite with Dr. Adrian Osai and a team she trusted, and lighting that Cassius had chosen himself, warm and low, the kind that made the room feel like the inside of something held carefully. Remy was asleep 2 floors up with Quame, and they would tell him in the morning, and his response to the news, delivered with the solemnity of a 4-year-old receiving information of great national importance, would be to nod twice, request to see the baby immediately, and then inform the room that he had already decided on a nickname which he would reveal when the time was right. The baby was healthy. Lungs strong, all 10 fingers, dark curls already somehow fully committed to their shape. The 3 brothers were all in the room when he arrived, which had required some choreography given the size of the suite and the requirements of the process, but Dr. Osai had managed it with the pragmatic grace of a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by the particular domestic arrangements of the people she worked for. They had each asked, separately, over the previous 8 days, whether they could be present. And Cassius had said yes to all 3 without hesitation, which had meant something to each of them in different ways that none of them fully articulated, but all of them carried. Dominic had cried. This was noted by all parties and would never be spoken of publicly. But it happened, stood at the back of the room with his arms folded and his face doing its usual controlled nothing, and then the baby made a sound, the first real sound, the specific cry of a person arriving and announcing themselves, and Dominic's face did something it had not done in the memory of anyone present, and he turned toward the window for 30 seconds, and when he turned back he was composed again. Vincent had held the baby second. He had looked down at the face, red and new, and absolutely certain of its own existence the way new things are, and his expression had gone through several calculations that did not resolve into any of his usual conclusions. He stood there longer than he meant to. Remy's little brother looked up at him from whatever interior distance newborns regard the world, and Vincent, who had spent 48 hours building a surveillance architecture designed to outsmart one of the most methodical men he had ever encountered, found himself completely without a next move. He was fine with that. Julian had held the baby last because Julian knew himself well enough to know that he needed to go last, because going last meant he could take as long as he needed without feeling like he was holding up the order of things. He sat down with the baby in the rocking chair, the one he had carried up 3 flights because the elevator had felt wrong for something this important, and he talked to him, quietly. The way he talked to Remy when Remy was scared, the way he talked to Cassius when the nights got heavy. Just words, easy and warm, no destination. The baby's eyes were closed. Julian talked anyway. Cassius watched from the bed, his body exhausted and his face more open than it had been in all the months they had known him. The walls he had lived behind for years, the ones built from surviving bad things and learning not to need too much, had not come down completely. Walls built over a lifetime didn't come down in 8 months, but there were doors in them now, doors that hadn't been there before. He had asked for things this week. Small things, the window open at night because he slept better with air moving, the overhead lights off in the evenings because the softness helped. A conversation with all 3 brothers together, the 4 of them at the table with no agenda and no update to deliver, just time, just existing in the same room without a crisis organizing it. They had done all of it. Without question, without the slight, practiced hesitation of men recalibrating their schedule, with the ease of people for whom this was simply how things were now. Dominic had asked 2 days after Voss what would make the building feel like home rather than a secure location. Cassius had looked at him for a long moment before answering, because the question itself, the fact of it, the directness, the way Dominic had asked it like he genuinely intended to act on the answer, had needed a moment to settle. Then he had answered. And Dominic had listened with the focused attention he gave to every briefing that mattered, and then had gone and done what was asked, and had not made a production of it. The nursery now had a second window, real curtains instead of blackout panels, a shelf of books Cassius had chosen, the mobile with the silver stars still turned in the corner, because Cassius had built that room and those stars were his, and they were staying. The building did not feel like a territory anymore. It was beginning to feel like something else. The word for it was simple. It was a word the Raedan brothers had never applied to themselves before, not for lack of it existing, but because none of them had been certain they were allowed to have it. Men who built empires and survived the unsurvivable and made decisions that shaped whole networks of lives tended to assume that the ordinary human things were for other people. That power exempted you from need. It did not. It never had. What it had done was make need harder to admit. Home. The building was beginning to feel like home. Remy came down at 6 a.m., escorted by Quame, pajamas on, hair completely ignoring the concept of direction. He walked into the suite with the careful formality of someone approaching a significant occasion and stopped at the foot of the bed and looked at the baby in Julian's arms. A long look, thorough, the kind only a 4-year-old can give, unfiltered and complete. Then he looked at his mother. Then at each of his fathers. Then back at the baby. He looks like all of us, Remy announced. Julian laughed, the real laugh, the one that didn't manage itself. Yeah, he said, he does. Remy climbed carefully onto the bed beside Cassius and leaned against his arm, and Cassius put a hand on top of his head, and the room held all 5 of them, and the city below kept doing what cities did, indifferent and continuous. The Raedan brothers were not the same men who had stood at a penthouse window 8 months ago, and felt the strange, unnamed weight of wanting something they didn't have words for. They had the words now. They had more than the words. What Armand Voss had spent 4 years trying to use against them, the love, the need, the vulnerability of it, had turned out to be the thing that made them something his entire operation had never accounted for. Human. Fully, completely. Without apology, human. And that was the thing no enemy could map. Because maps required a fixed subject, and these 5 people, in this room, in this building, in this life they were making up together in real time with all the mess and tenderness and stubbornness that required, were not fixed. They were still becoming. And what they were becoming was something none of them had a name for yet. But Remy looked up from his mother's side at the window where the early city light was beginning to come through, and said, with the absolute confidence of a child who was entirely certain about the things that mattered, "This is my favorite morning ever." Nobody argued. The window was open, the air was moving, the baby was asleep in Julian's arms, and for the first time in as long as any of them could remember, the most powerful thing in the room was not strategy, or wealth, or the reach of a name that moved through the underworld like a wave. It was just this. Just them. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath, rooting for Cassius, smiling at Remy, or feeling something shift in your chest when Dominic turned toward that window, then you already know what this channel is about. We tell stories that go past the surface. Stories about power and love and the cost of needing people and the courage it takes to let yourself be known. Subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss a single story. New ones are coming and they are built for people who want to feel something real. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us which moment hit you hardest. Tell us what Remy's nickname for his brother should be. Tell us what you think Dominic said to that window. Your thoughts inspire the people sitting next to you in the comments, and this community is built one honest reaction at a time. Share this story with someone who needs it today, and we will see you in the next one.